Very pleased to start the next session of the conference, which is going to be looking at how we can renew our somewhat shredded social fabric. Obviously, a really key feature of the whole community power vision is having that strong social fabric. And I'm very pleased to say that the session will be chaired by Will Tanner, who is the Chief Executive of Onward. For those who don't know, Onward is a think tank on the centre-right, a really interesting organisation, unlike a lot of other think tanks on the right that are still somewhat focused on the market model. Onward has really embraced a community power vision, and the fact that Onward is really increasing its influence in government and at Westminster, I think, is a really positive sign of how this community power vision is beginning to influence the whole political spectrum. So I will hand over to Will, and he will introduce the session in more detail and introduce our panelists. Over to you, Will.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you so much for having me today and for that very warm introduction. It's fantastic to be here, and I just want to start by paying tribute to the work of New Local over the last few years in really bringing the community paradigm to the fore of British politics and engaging with people on left and right around these issues. As you said, my name is Will Tanner. I'm delighted to chair this session because I think it really does relate to the most important political challenge of our time: how to rebuild the fabric of our communities, to give people back a much greater sense of belonging and place that perhaps has been lost in recent decades. And I'm particularly thrilled to do it with two of the most interesting thinkers and commentators on these issues, Danny Kruger and Kim Leadbeater. We are, in the words of Bob Putnam, increasingly bowling alone. The institutions and networks that bring us together at local level, which sustain our local communities, that sustain those vital connections to one another, are rapidly and noticeably falling away. In the last 20 years, Onward research has shown that 1 in every 4 pubs, 1 in every 4 libraries have closed. We're less likely to be a member of a local group, a trade union, a church, a community association than we were a few decades ago. And around 7 in 10 people think that community is in a state of decline. So there is a big challenge, but we're here today to talk about the positive, the opportunity. I particularly want to look at how community power as a methodology, as a principle, as a philosophy, can be a springboard for a reversal of some of these trends and a movement to a better political economy in which people feel some of that stronger sense of belonging and community. So we'll ask questions like, how can we empower local people, both individually and collectively, to take back control of their communities and rebuild that fabric that holds those communities together? How can we reverse some of those trends and rebuild those institutions, those frameworks that people operate within at local level and that mediate between the interests of individuals and different groups? And how can we make community power a lasting legacy of the last year, in which I think we've all been reminded of what can be lost when we don't have some of those forums to work and come together in the interests of our community. As I said at the beginning, I'm joined by 2 people who know this issue far better than me and are kind of leading thinkers on the issue of community power. They need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. The first is Danny Kruger. Danny is the MP for Devizes, a long-time advocate for a more local, relational and empowering politics. And Kim Leadbeater is known to many of you as an ambassador for the Jo Cox Foundation, which she's been doing since the organisation was set up in the wake of her sister's tragic death in 2016, and has demonstrated that community power is possible through a lot of her work, her direct work in communities through the foundation and through other causes. We'll be leaving lots of time at the end of the session or after their remarks for questions. So please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and I will come to them as soon as our remarks are over. So without further ado, I will shut up now, and I'm going to hand over to Danny Kruger first. So Danny, as I said, MP for Devizes, the founder of Only Connect in the West London Children's Zone, someone who's done this in practice as well as in politics, and the author of not only a few books, but also a big review for the Prime Minister last year on levelling up communities. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Will. Very, very pleased to be here with you all, and really echo Will's point. It is tremendous to hear colleagues on the right, on the centre right, talking about the most important challenge for our country being rebuilding social fabric, strengthening local communities, and empowering places. For me, this is part of something really important and exciting and positive that's happening in our culture, in our political culture, and in just life in this country. And I share all the distress and anxiety about the loss of social fabric, and I've been part of Will's commission looking at that. And New Local have demonstrated this. There's lots of really important evidence of how we're losing the institutions that connect us and the gathering places of our communities. But actually, this sort of political movement that in a sense Will and I represent, I think reflects something positive that is happening in society. And yes, we're losing the pubs and the post offices and the libraries, and the high streets are under attack, and church attendance is down, and all of these trends that Bob Putnam first started talking about 40 years ago. But there's a countercurrent, and it's a really encouraging one. And we've all seen it very intensely in this last year, and new forms of solidarity and gathering are taking shape and finding expression. And I don't think technology is the answer to everything, and I don't think that it's okay that we're losing our physical assets in our libraries. I'm really, really concerned to restore our social fabric in quite a traditionalist way, actually. But we have the essential ingredient for that rebuilding, which is that people want to do it, and they want to connect, and they want to work together. And that is the greatest asset. That is the capital of our society that we are very rich in. And the evidence of that is really strong this year. And that was the basis of the report I did last year. So and just making the political point, for me, there's no reason why my party shouldn't be contesting for this ground. The left have every claim to it as well. Liberals do too. Nobody owns civil society, but the right should not be abandoning this and saying this is all some kind of lefty nonsense and we should just plough ahead with market-based reform. My party stands for trusting the people, and what the people want, all the evidence suggests, is communities that are livable, that give occasion for belonging and neighbourliness, and that speaks to a deep tradition going back hundreds of years on the Conservative side of politics. So I want to fight for this. My report, very quickly, forgive everyone who might have been on a previous platform where I've spoken about it. I'll just run through the three headings, ending in the one that's most relevant to us today. The first is around place, and I think there is a massive agenda which is around restoring our social fabric, quite meaningfully around planning reform, around the sort of taxation, the way we're going to revive our high streets and as I say, the gathering places, and to directly invest in local institutions and social infrastructure. There's a big role for private capital. That's where the real money is ultimately, and where's investment going? Why isn't it going into the places that need it, and into the sort of projects that need it? And there are tweaks and nudges that government could make to ensure that, and are very serious about doing. DCMS and Cabinet Office working hard on that. Very pleased the social investment tax relief was renewed in the budget just now. There's also direct public funding, and levelling up fund is important. The community ownership fund, which has just been announced, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. We all know that these funds could go wrong. They could consolidate the current, broken model, but they really have the opportunity. And I know ministers are alive to the importance of designing those funds in a way that supports this agenda. So there's a whole piece around that I put under place. Second, around people, I won't talk much about, but I think there's a big role around brokering supply and demand for voluntary action. So a volunteer passport, new role for faith communities to be more involved in sort of the mainstream of social action. But then my last heading is around power, which is what we're talking about today. And I'll very quickly say, I think there's a big piece around data, which needs to be sort of properly community owned. Let's not, I think that we should be harnessing big tech. We should be having a conversation with them around their contribution they can make, but that might just be giving lots of money to community groups to do this work. And certainly any data that is gleaned from communities needs to be owned by those communities. So there's a big sort of data and tech power question, but we've got the opportunity to use data and digital in a transformative way for our communities is enormous. Public value, social value commissioning is a big theme. Public service reform, I feel that's kind of we've suddenly lost momentum a bit with other things going on, but there is the opportunity to, I think, create a better settlement in public services that are more communitarian, more locally owned. We have a vision for their citizen as being less of a sort of passive recipient of some state service and more of an agent of their own well-being, with power and responsibility where appropriate, and much more responsibility for frontline workers. So better public service model. And then lastly is community power. And I think we need, and I'm inspired here particularly by the work of Donna and Adam and others at New Local to argue for a Community Power Act, which will change the balance of power directly by saying people have the right to challenge, community groups have the right to challenge the system to take responsibility for the design and delivery of services locally and decision making in their neighbourhood. So there's lots of ways to do this. Adam's the expert, but I think we could basically upend the power system so that communities are properly in charge. And I think a bold centre-right government which trusts people should be pushing in this direction. So that's it from me. Look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Will.
Thank you so much, Danny. That's a fantastic way for us to begin the session, not least because you made clear that this is not all doom and gloom, despite the fact that we have seen some things subside or kind of drift away in the last few decades. There is a huge opportunity before us to kind of reclaim this space. You made clear this is a cross-party cause. It's not linked to any one party. And as we have discussed previously, I think the best thing for this agenda is if left and right kind of started to compete in a kind of arms race around community. That would be the best thing for driving greater powers and control to a local level. So I think there is a real opportunity. And I loved what you said at the end about inverting the system so that communities are properly in charge. Fantastic. Well, we will now move on to Kim. Kim, you are an ambassador for the Joe Cox Foundation, chair of the Batley and Spen More in Common volunteer group, spokesperson for the Great Get Together. You've done so much in communities to bring us together and to revive some of these ties that really do kind of bind us together and give communities power. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Will. Thank you, Danny. Thank you to Donna, and thank you to everybody at New Local for inviting me to be part of this brilliant conference. I haven't managed to tune into everything, but I came to the opening ceremony yesterday, and then I attended a couple of sessions yesterday along with Andy Burnham's session this morning. And I have to say, I felt a little bit like I'd come home. I thought, oh, these are my people. Here they are. And that was a really lovely feeling. So many of the comments and the brilliant contributions so far have really resonated with me, and I just hope I can add a little bit of something to the really powerful discussions. As Danny and Will have said, my life changed forever in June 2016 when my sister Jo was murdered, going about her duties as the MP for Batley and Spen here in West Yorkshire, which is where I join you from today. And I've said repeatedly, when something so horrific and genuinely unbelievable happens in your life, everything that you think you know and understand changes. And my life will never be the same again. But despite being at the centre of something so horrific, which could easily make anybody lose their faith in humanity, I've been lucky to be surrounded by people who have actually demonstrated the very best of humanity, and enabled me to keep going. And not just to survive, but hopefully to create a really powerful legacy for Jo that has a positive impact on as many people and organisations as possible. Now, whenever I speak publicly, I'm always very quick to point out that I am not an expert in a lot of the stuff that I talk about, whether that's cohesion or politics or extremism or indeed community. And I suppose the first point that I want to make today is that I've had to work really hard to value my voice. and to value my lived experience. But what I do think has changed in the last few years is that we are starting to value lived experience a lot more. I know it's become a little bit of a cliched expression, but I do think that those voices need to be heard. So I end up getting asked to do things. I find myself in these quite scary, quite intimidating settings like today, but I make myself do it because I think that lived experience is really important. And I'm pleased to say that that change is happening. So I do make myself sit alongside the academics and alongside the politicians and try and value my contribution, because I've got first-hand experience of a community coming together in a crisis. And I know how powerful it can be. I saw it when Joe was murdered, and I've seen it again during the last year. And I was plunged into several new worlds in 2016, politics at a national level and a local level, the criminal justice system, the media, and my local community more so than ever before. And whilst my position is unbelievably horrific, I've also realised it's quite unique and actually quite powerful, because I've got no hidden agenda. I've got a can-do attitude. And I've also got at the forefront of my mind, what's the worst thing that could happen? Because the worst thing that could happen did happen to me. So, whatever I can try and achieve as a result of that has got to be a good thing. What I've also realised is that Joe's foundation is in a pretty unique position. We work cross-party. We work on the issues that people care about. Joe wasn't a tribal politician, and she worked cross-party on a number of issues, particularly around loneliness and a number of other things. And we really want to try and do that. And that's why it's really good for me to be on sharing a platform with Danny today, and well indeed. We're also quite unique as an organisation that we've got a fairly small staff team, some based in London, some based in Batley here in West Yorkshire. So we've got a good national perspective, and we've got a really powerful local perspective. And I think that is something to be really valued. And before lockdown, I'd spend a lot of my time going between London and Yorkshire. So I would spend time in the corridors of power in Westminster, or the crack house, as Andy Burnham referred to it this morning, probably now quite famously. But I'd often find myself sat in meetings in Westminster and in London thinking, oh my God, take that to Dewsbury, take that to Batley, take that to Hartlepool or to Darlington or wherever, and they'll tell you to bugger off, because it doesn't make any sense to people's lives. So we've got to try and find a way to bridge those worlds. And I guess that's one of the things that I feel passionate about for me personally and for Joe's foundation. And I think there's probably lots of people on here today who can relate to that. I think Joe's foundation has also got a really important style that is very reflective of this conference. We focus on doing with people, not doing to people. We focus on listening. We focus on partnering, empowering and collaborating, all of which were very Joe and all of which are very me. So there's loads I could talk about in terms of community and Joe's foundation, because it's at the heart of an awful lot of what we do. And hopefully that explains why, this conference does feel really important to me. I'll talk a little bit about the stuff that we've done sort of up to the pandemic and up to lockdown, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we've done since. Locally, as Will said, I chair an amazing group of volunteers here in West Yorkshire. And what happened in our community after Joe was killed was that there was an unbelievable sense of shock, which just reverberated across the area and indeed the country and indeed the world. And as emotions run really high, there was a sense that, this could do even more damage than losing Joe. It could become something which made the community fracture. And we didn't want that to happen. And it didn't happen, because what people did was they pulled together. And this is what we see in a crisis. So with the support of my parents, I began working with this amazing bunch of volunteers who on the surface appears to have very little in common. We're sort of a bit of a hodgepodge bunch of people from different backgrounds. It's kind of this strange, dysfunctional family that shouldn't work on paper, but actually it does work. And we've done some amazing things at a community level in terms of events that we've organised and projects that we've put on. Joe would have absolutely loved it. And this more in common principle and ethos, I think, is really fundamental to working at a community level. It's about reaching out across the political spectrum to people from all faiths and different backgrounds, bridging divides and making a difference on the issues that affect us all. What I didn't realise at the time as all this was going on was this is community power. I mean, it was just people doing stuff and people going, yeah, something needs to be done, let's do it. Now, it wasn't always easy. And I had some really challenging meetings in those early days. The first meeting in particular, there was a lot of, if I'm honest, a lot of slagging off the council. There was a lot of, the council should be doing this and the council should be doing that, and that's not our job. And I was like, whoa, hang on a minute. We can sit here for 2 hours and moan about what's not been done, or we can decide what we're going to do about it as people who live in this community, and then we can maybe speak to the council about that and try and do stuff together, and it'll be twice as good. And there was a bit of a sea change, I think, with some people. It's like, yeah, do you know what, Kim, that actually is an option. So that's kind of how we approached it. And what ended up, over a period of a few months and years, was that we've got a really powerful relationship with our local council now, Kirklees Council. We work together on loads of different stuff, but we've had to build that trust, and that does take time. The other thing that we had to do was navigate the local politics, which is another dimension of difficulty, thinking that, was there a political agenda behind what we were doing? And it took us a long time to prove that there wasn't. We just wanted what was right for the community. That was what this was about. And what I learned really quickly there, I suppose, was that the voluntary sector and the public sector need to understand each other more, and I think need to value each other more. And I learned that sort of fairly quickly. And also, let's not forget the private sector. I think because I've got a background in all three, I've seen firsthand the strengths that they all have, but also some of the limitations that they have. And I think we've got to really try and bring those strengths together. That's why I really push everything to be done on a cross-sector basis. And also, let's not forget that at the centre of all those sectors are human beings. So actually, we're not that different after all, because we're all made up of people. I think that's really important to remember. So I spent about 2.5 years navigating this landscape, and at the same time building up a really powerful network at a local level, which I think was fundamental in achieving the things that we achieved. So yeah, I say navigating the landscape. Sometimes I was just sort of bulldozing through it, but you've got to do what you've got to do. So that's something about the local work that we've done. And what I do think actually is, on the back of that, this More in Common group is a real sort of way of capitalising on some of the stuff that's happened in the last 12 months. All the mutual aid groups that have popped up. I think a lot of those are probably now looking for a home, and we are developing a network of More in Common groups across the whole UK through Joe's Foundation, and we would love to work with any mutual aid groups that you have in your local areas who want to become a bit more formalised or a bit more organised, but not too formalised, and become a More in Common group. That would be amazing. A couple of other bits and pieces just to talk about in those early days. We've done a huge amount on loneliness, which I think has been really important. We've got the world's first ever Minister for Loneliness, the world's first ever government strategy for loneliness, working collaboratively with other organisations who've been talking about loneliness for years. It wasn't a new subject. It just needed a bit of a turbocharge. So that was important. We do the Great Get Together, which we do on what would have been Joe's birthday every year, where we ask communities to organise events together in June. And again, I think we need more platforms like that. More open platforms where there isn't an agenda. It's just about bringing people together. So we're doing the Great Get Together again this year. Use it. It's a platform, and it's not about fundraising. It's not about anything other than bringing people together. So what all that meant, sorry, I know I'm going to go over time here. What all that meant was that when COVID hit, I just felt like we were ready. Suddenly, we've got loads of people talking about community and neighbourliness and connection and loneliness and mental health and all these things that bind us together as human beings. And I just felt like probably lots of you did, oh my God, this is what we've been banging on about. But once again, why does it take a crisis to bring these things to the forefront? Why aren't we living in those well-connected, compassionate communities all the time? And I think now is the turning point where we've got to ask those questions and we've got to think about the answers. So a couple of things that we did as a result of the pandemic and lockdown. Nationally, we set up the Connection Coalition. So we pulled together with a number of organisations, including the Red Cross, Mind, Age UK, the Cares Family, and it was wonderful. Our first CEO, Iona Lawrence, was heavily involved in this piece of work, and Iona and I were speaking about the fact that there were lots of men on telly in suits, no disrespect, Danny, telling people what they couldn't do. And we were saying, well, where is the narrative around how we're going to keep connected during lockdown? Where is the narrative about how we're going to look after people's mental health and well-being? Where are we talking about loneliness? And those conversations were just a bit lacking. So we pulled together Connection Coalition to give organisations a space to do that. And, we've got 800 organisations signed up to the Connection Coalition. We didn't even promote it. We didn't even push it or talk about it. And it just shows you that there's such a desire there to do this work collaboratively. And that's around loneliness and isolation, mental health and well-being, and grief and bereavement, and the intersections that play out between those different issues. So that was amazing. Locally, my amazing team up here in West Yorkshire were involved in the direct community response work. So because we built up this relationship with the council, because we built up this powerful network, they asked us to help And we said, yeah, absolutely. And the voluntary sector did what the voluntary sector does. It just got on with it. It just mobilised. People needed feeding. People needed prescriptions. People needed someone to talk to. And we just did it. And there were some frustrations at those early days. I sat in a lot of meetings with the council, far too many meetings. And we needed to build that relationship. Again, the balance between, yes, doing things properly and professionally, but also just getting stuff done. So there was some frustrations, but also some really positive stuff came out of it. And there was a great guy talking yesterday, I think it was Paul from Grimsby, and he was saying about the local authority had to step out of its comfort zone. It had to be brave. It had to enable others, and it had to go for genuine collaboration. That was really, really powerful. So we did all sorts of stuff, giving out wellbeing packs, making phone calls. We're now working on digital inclusion. We're looking at mental health, loads more stuff. And it's really, really powerful stuff. And I'm very proud of it. In terms of what happens next, my last little bit, the call to action thing is, what are my learnings? Loads. But I think going forward, we've got to think about working cross-sector, really, really important. Again, it's been alluded to lots of times over the past couple of days already. It has to be top down and bottom up. That's why it's brilliant that Danny's here today to talk about what the government's doing about this stuff. But, let's also keep thinking really closely about the grassroots stuff that's going on. Accepting, sadly, sometimes that change does take time. I find that really frustrating, but I guess we've got to accept that as well. Being inclusive, being collaborative, not competitive, making volunteering easy and flexible. That's a big one. And I think fundamentally at the heart of that, as my sister said, really pulling together in our communities and focusing on the things that we've got in common rather than the things that divide us. Thank you so much, Will.
Kim, thank you so much. That was incredibly inspiring. And you said at the beginning that we need to do more to value lived experience. Well, you've just given us a lesson in the value of lived experience and the lessons that can be applied more broadly from your own doings. I was also really struck by the fact that you started by saying that this feels like home, because home is one of those words, I think apocryphally, but people say Shakespeare said it was the most important word in the English language, and it is a word that is incredibly powerful in this context. And I know Danny has spoken very eloquently about the importance of home in the past too. So we're now going to move on to questions. We've got about 20 minutes left, and thank you to everyone who's been pouring in questions into the chat. Lots of fantastic questions, including from lots of familiar names, which is brilliant to see. I'm going to start by giving Danny the opportunity to come back on a few questions that were cropping up while he was speaking about the kind of government's response to his review and where it goes next, because I think everyone agrees it was a fantastic piece of work, but obviously the point of policy development is to change government policy. So I'd be interested to hear from you, Danny, on what the next steps are and what the response has been like from the PM and those around him. And then Kim, I'll come back to you on a specific question after that, if that's right.
Thanks. Well, to try and be quick about this, the fact is this agenda that we all share here is just one framework through which we can see the challenges of the country. And I'm not, I'm not the only one trying to encourage the government in a certain direction. And I regret I haven't, frankly, been more successful in inspiring the narrative. And I just want to echo Kim's point there. I feel personally that whether it's the government ministers or the media or nationally, we did fixate so much on both on restrictions, what you can't do, but also on what the impact of the pandemic was for individuals rather than for communities. And I think we didn't articulate the real truth and the extraordinary paradox of this disease, which is that it works through social contact, and beyond the appalling impact on individuals and of course families, its damage to communities is so real. And I wish we'd said more about how we should be thinking about supporting and restoring our communities. But the fact is, we all know communities themselves stepped in the most amazing way, and government did get behind that and supported it locally and nationally in a big way. But not rhetorically enough. Not the narrative, I feel, has been lacking. However, on my practical proposals, there's been really, I think, some very encouraging work going on in government. So the stuff I've mentioned around place and planning, I know that I've been able to feed into conversations around planning reform and around the whole question of high streets, towns, fund design, and so on. And that work is going on. So I'm hoping I know there is real recognition of the importance of social fabric, social infrastructure in places, and I, really hope that we do see evidence of that in the eventual reforms that are being discussed around planning. The DCMS is due to report back quite soon, I think, don't know when, and MHCLG, so the civil society bit of government and the local government bit of government are both reviewing the recommendations that pertain to them. The volunteer passport idea, I know, is being considered in DCMS and I hope proposals and plans are being worked up around that. The minister at MHCLG, Stephen Greenhalgh, is really pushing hard on the faith deal I suggested, which is about giving faith communities a greater role in social action. I've been having really positive discussions with ministers around digital policy and the role of digital and data in civil society, which I mentioned. That's encouraging. And fiscally, as I mentioned, we've seen the renewal of SITR, which was under threat. Very important bit of fiscal support for social investment in places and causes that don't attract commercial capital. And we've seen a levelling up fund, and now we have this community ownership fund, and there's the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, all of which are being designed, I hope, in a way, and I hope that I've been able to, in some way, nudge government towards this agenda. So on the practicalities of my proposals, I'm heartened that government is taking them all seriously. I wish that, this rhetoric, this narrative that we're articulating here was coming out of the Prime Minister's mouth, but, he's got a big set of priorities and concerns, and I don't think that I think there's everything to play for, and I think the more we can all push cross-party and within my party on this, the better. I think the Chancellor, who talks about the infrastructure of everyday life quite a lot in his budget speech, referenced this agenda too. I think he's an ally, so I am hopeful. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. And I'm sure lots of people will be very encouraged by all of that, and also grateful for you for doing the hard slog after the report to ensure that the right people are taking up your proposals. So I'm going to now ask a question which has come up in the chat a few times, which is about how we can ensure that the kind of mutual aid outpouring of the last year. You spoke about this very passionately, Kim, just the community stepping in. Danny, you've just said exactly the same thing. How can we ensure that that is made permanent after the pandemic? As you said, Kim, these things happen in response to a crisis, but I think we're all lamenting the fact that they don't become routine in the good times too. And I wondered what both of your thoughts, but perhaps starting with Kim, were on what we need to do to make it permanent, and whose responsibility is it? Is it citizens themselves? Is it local government, or is it politicians in Westminster? Kim, you first.
I think the short answer to that last bit there is that it has to be everybody's responsibility. I think we have to just sit back and reflect a little bit and think about what were the really powerful things that came out of it. We probably can't keep all of it going, because the reality is a lot of the people who've been doing the groundwork on this are going to have to go back to work, and it might be people who've been furloughed. They're probably going to have to go back to their level of normal lives as well. I think we have to look at the connections that have been made and find a way to keep those connections going. And I think that has to be done by local councils will now know where those people are. Certainly across our area, we've all got networks. We've been having meetings. Let's just make sure those meetings don't stop, but let's make sure we're also clear about what our roles and responsibilities are going forward. My worry, and I've seen this in the chat, I think today and yesterday, is that what the councils mustn't now do is go, oh God, you guys are really good at this, carry on. That mustn't happen, because then we're no better off. So this is about the true collaboration that has to take place, isn't it? And we're working on this at the moment. One of the ideas that we're working with our local council on is, I talked about the Connection Coalition, having a local version of the Connection Coalition. So this would be, the council, private sector and the voluntary sector working together on the issues that I talked about: loneliness, mental health, social isolation, etc. And that, I think, would be a really good forum for everybody working together and keeping that going in the way that it's been going so far. So yeah, I think let's just make sure we're having these conversations. Like today's great, but it doesn't end here, does it? We have to keep going with this.
Thank you, Kim. Danny, what's your view? What should we be doing to make sure that this all
echo Kim's point about the sort of cultural conversation around this. It should never be discounted. I mean, we're all, I hope, practical people, but really it's the atmosphere that will sustain this as much as anything. So the more we are talking and doing this stuff, the more it'll seep into the consciousness of decision makers and of ordinary citizens as something that we do together. But practically speaking, I think there's two things. One is around the infrastructure. I mean, that supports civil society, and there's a whole raft of reforms need, I think, to be made to support civil society and to support the local mutual aid revolution that we've seen, as well as the existing previous VCSs and others that were operating. So, we've seen a really sad falling away in the infrastructure of civil society over the last couple of decades, and we need to restore that as well. So part of that is digital, as I've mentioned. Part of it is about places and assets, but really it's about the networks, the brokers. I see Nick Gardam's on here, community organizing, the ligaments of civil society, the structures that support it, which often get neglected, or they're the first things to get cut. So that needs to be restored. And then the other practical thing is at more at a national level, there's legislation. And I go back to the point about a Community Power Act, and Adam's the one to speak on this, but how exactly we enshrine into law an obligation on the public system to heed the views and wishes of residents and practitioners feels the great prize. And again, that'll have a major cultural impact. It'll just send a signal through the system. But it could also enshrine in law obligations and mutual rights and responsibilities that could change the narrative and basically mean that community power is here to stay.
Thank you, Danny. Well, so building on that, I'm going to now take two separate questions which have been asked and kind of bring them together, because I think they feed off one another quite clearly. So Lucy Buckfield from British Future has asked, how can we unite political coalitions to build momentum for national government to prioritise uniting communities after COVID? And there's been a separate question asking, how do we stop community power becoming a Labour or Conservative thing and become more whole society? Is there a genuine chance of consensus here? So Kim, can I come to you first, and then I'll come to Danny, and then we'll, I think, hopefully be able to have one more round of questions before we close. Kim.
Yeah, you can come to me with that really easy question. Thanks, Will. How do we unite politicians on anything is a real challenge, isn't it? But I think we've got to, locally and nationally, look at the councillors and look at the politicians who are in this space, like Danny, and say, right, now is the time for you to start having these conversations on a cross-party basis. Now is the time for us all to be working together on this sort of thing. But that has to come from them, and we have to lose the tribalism of politics, and this has to be about the greater good, doesn't it? And, again, it does go back to the whole principle of more in common. I know we all have slightly different views on what our communities might look like, but I think we all feel that the power of connection is really important. We feel that we don't want to be living in communities where people are lonely. We don't want to be living in communities where people can't feed themselves. So there's a huge amount of consensus on some really fundamental issues. So I think we've just got to try and keep that common ground that COVID has shown us. The whole we're all in the same sea but we're sailing different boats narrative that we've heard dozens of times. Yes, that's absolutely true. This has been the one thing in all our lifetimes that has brought us together and unified us in a way like nothing else. It really has stripped down to how we treat each other as human beings and the issues that we face as human beings. So now absolutely is the time for politicians to take a step back from the tribalism and say, let's come together on the issues that COVID has highlighted as being a problem for communities.
Danny, what do you think the prospects of that are?
Well, actually, I've approached it from a slightly different angle. I mean, I slightly warn against the goal of consensus, because actually we need to have a conversation which can sometimes be robust and with some useful disagreement to get to move forward. And I worry a bit about the idea that it's possible to for politicians just to get together in a room and agree what is needed, and then give that to the country as the consensus. Actually, we need a conversation with the public that involves some dispute. But what we do need, what we both think are agreeing on, is the goal around community power and a more neighbourly, more sustainable, more local, more relational society. And that is a vision that both sides, both tribes could and should be aiming at. And then we disagree about the methods. And a good parallel is the environmental debate. We are all agreed now that there's an absolute overwhelming imperative to decarbonise. And left and right are trying to compete for how green they can look and sound and be. But we disagree to a degree on how to get there. So obviously conservatives stress more kind of technological innovation, and the left will stress more about using the law to restrain bad practice. We both think a bit of both, but we have a bit of a sense of which side we're on. On this agenda, I think there is an interesting distinction between those like me who feel that there's the big opportunities for private capital. Others on the left think there's the real imperative is to undo austerity and to invest in the public sector. And those two things, we argue about which of those are going to help support this third space, which is communities. That's a really helpful argument to have. So I think we should. I say this. John Cluddis and I are often on panels, and we both agree we should be politely taking chunks out of each other about who's right about what is going to build a more relational communitarian society. And I think the adversarial politics could and should be our ally, because it enfranchises the public. If the politicians just get together in a room and agree on stuff, that's probably going to be wrong. So public dispute isn't all wrong, but I think probably are in agreement about the vision of a better society. I hope that.
Thank you. Danny, I think you're totally right. And I think, we do need to have a robust debate about it. This isn't just about, everybody sitting down and agree. And I think you're totally right. And I also think those things are probably not mutually exclusive. We probably can do a bit of all of that. And that's going to be the better way to come forward. A few people have mentioned in the chat there about the hyper-local nature of what's gone on. And that's something that I think is really important in this is the way that communities pull together at a really micro level. And I think those also are important voices to be heard by people at a national level.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Okay, so we've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to try and ask you each one question from some of the amazing questions that have been asked. I won't be able to come to everyone, I'm afraid, so apologies if I wasn't able to come to your question. But Danny, can I ask you Ian Chambers's question, which is, does the panel think that new funds for community groups, you've mentioned the Levelling Up Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Community Ownership Fund, are addressing the existing funding gap between wealthy communities and low-income communities? And before you answer, I'm just going to ask Kim her question so she can start thinking about it, which is Jenny Woodward's question, which is there a danger that we're putting the onus on communities struggling with hardship and low levels of cohesion to sort out their own problems? Are those communities best able to respond on their own, and just pushing power to them, is that going to work? So Danny, I'll come to you first, then Kim, and then I will close promptly at 12:40.
Right. Okay. Well, very quickly then, we have there's an enormous imperative to get these funds right, so that they do they do go to the places that need it. A challenge is always, if we're talking about supporting communities, we need to, often it's only the communities with the existing infrastructure, the kind of assets, social assets that can successfully bid for that money. But there do need to be communities that can receive the money, and there need to be institutions for those. So I think we need long-term funding to help places develop the capabilities and the ideas and the relationships that will then enable them to spend big money well. So there is a timing question, I think, is the answer to that. And just in terms of disparity of places, the good thing about the EU structural funds was that they deliberately went to they focused on the poorer regions, and we need to make sure those places are not disadvantaged through the new system that's being created. So yeah, I'm very conscious of this challenge, and I'm sure the government is too.
Thank you. And very quickly, Kim, what's your view on whether these types of communities are best placed to do this?
Well, this goes back to what I said earlier. What we mustn't do is just throw it all on the communities. That's the worst thing that we can do. Now, it has to be about collaboration. It has to be about councils and communities working together and getting the best from everybody for everybody. So yes, it's right to empower people, but we also need to support people as well. And I totally agree with what Danny said there about long-term funding. You know, like many people on this call, I'm sick of applying for a grant that runs out in 6 months. So actually all you do is spend that 6 months planning for the next grant. So you can't actually get the work done that you really want to do, and by the time the 6 months ends, you know, you've only just scratched the surface of what you want to achieve. So long-term funding is really important, whether that's from the government or whether that's from funders like the lottery or whoever else. We need to change that model. And I think a couple of points raised in the chat there as well about communities. Absolutely right. All communities are not the same. So let's be really clear about that as well. We tend to use that as a very broad brush term, don't we? Let's look at inclusive communities where everybody's considered, whatever their backgrounds are, whether that's around race or faith or disability or whatever it is. And let's make sure everybody's needs are invested in the work that we do.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you, Danny, as well. I'm not going to try and wrap up or sum up the session because there's been too much for me to do so, and there isn't enough time left. But it just kind of leaves me to say thank you to both of you for sharing your thoughts so openly and for giving up your time. Thank you to everyone who asked a question and has engaged throughout the conference, and thank you for having me chair the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will, Danny and Kim. That was a really, really fascinating session. And thanks to everyone for the brilliant questions and comments in the chat. Really useful stuff there.